I think public buildings are the most important thing that architects do, because public buildings are for the public. You know, they're an expression of the kind of the small p politics of the society you're working in. So it's always, but for me, yeah, to work in a library or a museum or a school, all of those things are interesting because they're public. And those buildings, you know, they're the buildings that need to have a longer term life, and you have to think about how they're going to develop into the future. For me, architecture is it's a cultural practice. Yeah, so it's, although if you run a practice, you have to run a business, it's true, and you have to be professional. That's quite an important thing, because I think architecture is a profession because you have responsibilities to society, etc. But my real interest in architecture is as a cultural practice. And by that I mean, I'm interested in how you can make architecture today that is somehow connected with the history of architecture, of, for me, the history of European architecture. And I think until the beginning of the 20th century, that was self-evident. When you were an architect, the way you made architecture was to study and become immersed and become expert in the history of your discipline, and then bring those things to bear in the projects and the problems of the day. That's what you did. And you know, late 19th century, I think it was the same in Denmark, there was this period of eclecticism, which in the modernist period got a bad name, but actually I think it was an incredibly vital time. It was when architects were, it was the beginning of a professionalism. Architects had really a big knowledge about their discipline. They also had an increasing capacity, you know, because there were big projects at the end of the 19th century with industrialization, and they were interested in all kinds of architecture. So the same architect could make a classical railway station, or let's say a classical museum and a gothic railway station, for very good reasons, you know. And they were making those decisions on the basis of a kind of a knowledge, but also maybe on the basis of ambitions or ideas from their clients as well, which I also think is valid. At the beginning of the 20th century, you had this period of modernism. It was quite short, but it was highly distorting, I think. And all of a sudden, and only some modern architects were modernists. Many, many very modern architects continued to practice in that way I described as part of a continuity. But the modernists said somehow industrialization, the social traumas of industrial society, all of those things overturned every aspect of existence, and there had to be a completely new architecture with new forms. And actually the forms had nothing to do with those problems. The forms had to do with a new interest in abstraction that came out of painting. And it's very distorting that. And what's a bit hard to believe is that at the beginning of the 21st century, it's still the orthodoxy. It's not modernism anymore, it's neo-modernism, because nobody would ascribe any kind of ideological content to it. But it's still actually the mainstream way of practicing a kind of abstraction which becomes more and more reduced of energy and of any kind of relevance. And I think it's highly problematic. It's a fantastic expression of late capitalism. That's why it's the mainstream. But that other way of practicing, where you're an architect, you have a knowledge and an engagement with the history of your discipline, I think that that's still possible. It's still possible. I think it's still, it can be an extremely fruitful way of practicing. But it's a kind of marginal way of practicing now. I would say. For me, the interesting thing about place is that even with globalization, the tradition of architecture historically, but also the way you make architecture today, it's quite different in Denmark, in Germany, in Switzerland, in Britain, in France. They're all quite different. The way you work with a client is different. The capacity and the preferences of the industry are different. And of course, the history of architecture are different. Although they're connected, I think there's a real shared European architecture, but they're different, and those differences still exist. So, I mean, we do work across Western Europe, and I think the projects are all quite different depending on where they are. So the place is important, but for me the place is, it is the immediate site, but it's also kind of a deeper idea of the place. You know, it's the history and the culture of the place and how you read it today. We just finished a bank in Bremen, which we didn't know so well, but we knew Bremen was one of the Hanseatic port cities, and we knew that they had this tradition of brick architecture. And in our imagination, that brick architecture has a connection to British arts and crafts architecture. But it's a kind of, at the beginning of the 20th century, it was made more modern. It was kind of filtered through also an idea of an American commercial architecture. And work by some of those architects in the teens and the 20s in Germany by people like Höger and Pilzig, and they're not so well known, but they're these very special modern architects, but who are not modernist, making brick buildings largely. We were very aware of that, and so that was one of the first things we thought that we're going to make for this bank headquarters in the middle of Bremen. We were going to make a building that was our version of a Hanseatic building. So it would be brick, and it would have an elaborated brick facade. And in that competition, we were the only non-Germans invited. We thought everybody would do brick buildings. We were the only people to do a brick building. Yeah, all the German competitors did concrete, gridded facades. So, you know, go figure. I mean, sometimes I guess if you're too close to something, you don't see it. Maybe. I also think it's a comment on the state of German architecture.
How does architecture and memory relate to each other?
I think they're very connected. You know, I think architecture, I mean, I didn't make this up, but it's our collective memory. You know, if you walk around Copenhagen, which if we discount the last 20 years, is an amazing piece of city. And what's especially amazing is that in the post-war period, modernism was very strong here, but those architects continued to believe in the structure of the city. So they made modern projects that continued to sustain and to develop the structure of the city. The block structure, the scale, the materials, they used brick. And I think that if you look at a city like Copenhagen, also a city that wasn't bombed, that it is like a kind of an artifact that if, as you scratch and you scratch and you scratch, it tells you all of these things about, obviously it tells you things about history and its public buildings, but I also think it tells you things about the much more everyday occupation of the city, about when certain areas were popular and what that meant and how those areas were adopted because they were very bohemian or they were very working class or they were haute bourgeois. And all of those things, I think if you really look, the evidence of that occupation is like a layer on the structure of the city and its buildings. That's why, to me, the European city is one of the great human inventions, really, because it's this collective endeavor. It requires an enormous effort to make it. It requires enormous negotiations and consensus that it happens, and they're there, and they have this coherence, they have this variety, they have this flexibility and adaptability. Really good urban buildings, they might have been built as housing, but they really work well as offices or as schools. They might be factories once, and then they become workspace and lofts or whatever, or a museum. And all of those things are possible, that the physical thing which was built with a particular intention has all of this other potential in it. It's like magic. It's like alchemy. And unfortunately nowadays, when buildings are built as objects that are meant to stand out, they don't have any of that potential, that open-endedness. They're so specific that you can't help but think that as soon as the client who caused them to be gets bored of them, they'll just have to demolish them. And that's kind of the point. It's about architecture just becoming a commodity like fashion, which is in fashion, then out of fashion. And to me, that's the opposite of architecture.
You related art to architecture before. What kind of a relation is between those two?
Our practice has been very connected to the art world. In Britain, most of our projects have been public projects. Our best client for the last 16 years is Larry Gagosian. It's the biggest commercial gallery in the world. We've done 9 projects for him. And many of the galleries have opened with Cy Twombly shows. He does contemporary shows, modern shows. I'm quite good friends with Thomas Demand. We've done collaborations with him on a number of occasions. And we've collaborated with a lot of contemporary artists. And when we started our practice, the architecture scene in Britain was really boring, but the young British art thing was just starting. And it wasn't necessarily that art, although in the end Damien Hirst became an important client for us, but it wasn't necessarily that all of that art was so interesting to us, but the vitality of that scene and the way those artists were really making things work for themselves, because there was no infrastructure for them. There was an enormous suspicion of contemporary art in Britain then. It's changed a lot. So we looked a lot at contemporary art at kind of Dusseldorf School of Photography, people like Strutt and Gursky and Candido Hoffer, late 60s American artists like Robert Smithson, Gordon Matta Clark, Eva Hess, people like that, as a way of looking at the rather derelict London that we started our practice in 1990 in, and a way of, rather than being depressed by that dereliction, finding what was useful and what was even beautiful in this kind of post-industrial city. And we found a lot. And so I think we really learned how to look at things by looking at contemporary art. And we continue to have a lot of relationships with contemporary artists, and I'm very interested in it. And I said it in the lecture earlier that my artist friends would never use novelty as something that has any value in their work. To say that, oh, well, I've done something which is new, first of all, they said that's not credible, nothing is new. Everything's been done before. And even if it was new, why would that make it good? It's ridiculous. And all of them have a very clear relationship to the history of their discipline. So Thomas Demand, he is deeply respectful and interested in the work of Fischli Weiss, the generation before him, of Gerhard Richter, the generation before them. And then he's incredibly knowledgeable about the full history of art. And sometimes we've been working on things and we're talking about a Brown, and then he'll pull out an Ingres painting or a Dutch painting for a particular Brown. And it becomes a kind of instrumental thing that we're looking at in a Baroque painting. And that's how artists work. Why would they not be interested in that stuff? They're still, it's the same way that abstraction didn't kill figuration in art. You have abstract artists, you have people like Richter who work in both. I think most of them. I think to work purely as an abstract artist now, you only do it with some ironic distance. It's clear. But many, many artists work within a figural world. So abstraction didn't kill figuration. It was a blip, and it never stopped. Picasso always was basically a figural artist. So this idea of novelty and of the future and positivism, I don't know many. I mean, maybe it's the artists I know, but I don't think artists are too smart to think in that way. The tragedy of architecture is how stupid architects are. I think that's an issue. You spend too much time. We spend too much time trying to convince people to do things they don't want to do. That really lowers the level of the discussion, I think.